Dowd then tried to break from his communist advisors. This time the result was anything but bloodless.
The communists decided they weren't going to lose control, and they did a coup. And Dowd and large numbers of members of his family, many of the people I knew, were massacred in the royal palace.
Life before the Russian invasion was very simple and normal. People were busy with their lives and their jobs. There was democracy. The government was accepted by people. No one had political problems with each other.
In December 1979, Afghanistan was to become a battleground of the Cold War, when 80,000 Soviet troops invaded the country to support the unpopular and crumbling communist government. The Red Army arrived, still wearing the laurels of invincibility that they'd won against the Germans in the Second World War. But Afghanistan was to be their Vietnam.
They no doubt thought they could sort of expand the boundaries of the Russian Empire. But they made the same mistake that the British had made earlier and other people were to make later. They didn't realize the resistance and the independence of the Afghan people.
The Soviet forces came into Afghanistan more as a local police operation than a serious invasion. Not only were they not welcomed with open arms, they were openly opposed by the entire population, and the one thing that unites Afghanistan is the presence of an enemy, and all the country united against them. And what they had no notion of was that they were in for a huge, huge defeat.
Ever since the communists came to power, people had the feeling that the Russians would come to Afghanistan. Before the Russian invasion, they committed many crimes. They put thousands of people in prison, raped women, tortured and harassed people. And finally, many Afghans emigrated to Pakistan. The Mujahideen were Afghan people who took up weapons and made contact with many parties based in Peshawar.
During my first visit to Afghanistan in 1982, Soviet jets and helicopters dominated the skies. Trekking into the Panjshir Valley, I find myself in the midst of a huge Russian offensive, as villages were being bombed daily in an attempt to destroy the Mujahideen.
When we got in to the Panjshir Valley, which is north of Kabul, that was where Ahmed Shah Massoud was in charge, and there we found our first impression was what scorched earth policy is really like. Something like 40% of the population had evacuated. Every village had been bombed. The Russians had a policy of going in with a train of tanks and soldiers and just destroying everything they needed to, and then they would pull out again, leaving the place razed. Meanwhile, the villagers retreated to the mountains.
I met their leader, Ahmed Shah Massoud, who was a priority target. Starting out with only 40 men and a handful of old weapons in the summer of 1979, he'd built up the nucleus of a tough and well-trained guerrilla army.
Like Churchill, who told the British at the beginning of the Second World War that they were brave, and they became brave as a result. Massoud did that with his people. He whipped together these young Mujahideen and told them they were heroes, and they became heroes, and they ran rings around the Soviet army.
Despite the odds, lack of communications and modern weapons, Massoud was supremely confident.
We do not consider victory as the stopping of the fighting. Victory for us means being able to escalate the war against the Russians as much as possible. It's then that the Russians will be prepared to leave Afghanistan, or at least to come to the negotiating table.
Massoud, who was a brilliant guerrilla leader, had information of what their movements would be, and always retreated before they came, and then shot down on them, and very often ambushed them and blew out tanks.
In 1981, I was a commander of many villages in Bazaraka Panjshir, which is in central Panjshir. There we gave military training to the people. There were also many operations which took place in Panjshir. The 9th biggest operation, made by the Russian 40th Army, received a lot of casualties, especially in the area that was under my control.
In the face of Mujahideen opposition, the Russian forces dropped thousands of anti-personnel mines from the air, maiming and killing thousands of Mujahideen and even more civilians.
On the Salang Highway and in Panjshir, which was our area, when the Russians came to the highway, all the roads connected to the highway, or around their army bases, or where they knew our routes were, or anywhere where they felt in danger, they scattered mines. They caused many deaths. I've lost many of my friends.
Medical facilities were almost non-existent. The French volunteer doctor we travelled in with was almost certainly the only fully qualified doctor in the whole of the Panjshir Valley that year. We met one of Massoud's commanders, Abdul Wahid, who had had a foot blown off by a Russian mine. Massoud asked if we could help him.
My father said, "I'll see what I can do when I get back to London." And I think several months later, he got a phone call from Pakistan, and there was a voice saying, "Are the arrangements in place, and when should we come?" So I think the arrangements were quite quickly made, and Abdul Wahid came to Roehampton and had a prosthetic leg made there. And this led really to the idea of my father starting an appeal to help disabled Afghans.
An awful lot of the soldiers stepped on mines and had their feet blown off. A few months later, those that were lucky enough to get replacement legs through Sandy Gore or other sources were back fighting again, as if nothing had happened. They are a very remarkable race.
2 years later, the war was still grinding on, and I went back to see what was happening. Soviet helicopter gunships were continuing to savage the Mujahideen, and their only means of defense was the Soviet-made SAM-7 missile, which often failed to work.
The war with Russia was unfair. On the one side, the people of Afghanistan and the Mujahideen started jihad, our war, with empty hands and old weapons. At that time, the best weapons we had were the Kalashnikov and the RPG-7. We only used these two types of weapons. But later, we used 82